I'm not convinced it ain't no acting or accident what the track emits. You strapped with gas that you ain't even practiced with. The fact is, you couldn't hit the target the size of a track.
Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today we're going to be talking about the A&E biography on The Undertaker. So let's talk about this thing. Too long, didn't listen. This started out as a biography, and I think it kind of halfway through became sort of a tribute. And it stopped being so much about a biography. It sounded like very strong though, and his mom stole the show. His mom is great. She's the best mom ever. Probably the sweetest old lady of all time. Okay, so Undertaker, his story is so well known that you really don't really need to go to too much detail into the actual origins of the Undertaker. But when you look at his backstory, which I think is absolutely fascinating, it was probably the most fascinating part of the documentary, was everything that built up to him becoming the Undertaker, because we know everything after he becomes the Undertaker. So here is the thing. He grew up in Houston. He has 4 brothers, a stay-at-home mom, a dad that was kind of a jack of all trades. So, he worked for the Houston newspaper, but he also was a carpenter and among other things. He was a wrestling fan from childhood. His mom actually took him to the matches. And he became a fan of the original Sheik, Edward Farhat. And he talked about him and his friends aggravating the Sheik, and when he would do his feint of running into the crowd, how they would run away from him. And that he said he was mesmerized by pro wrestling as a kid. He said he played sports and kind of stopped watching wrestling. He started playing basketball, but he never played basketball until high school. And he says that he was, pretty tall guy. And since he was tall, but fairly thin, he started playing basketball, but wasn't really good. The original school he went to, which is the University of St. Thomas, ended up going bankrupt. And he ended up going to a school called Texas Wesleyan, where he played basketball. And he was a very physical basketball player, which reminded me a lot of like Bill Lambier, for if you old school basketball heads. It reminded me a lot of that, the way they were talking about it. During this time, his friends started to suggest that he lift weights, and one of his teammates was going to go into pro wrestling. And at the time, he wanted to try to make the basketball thing work. So instead, he decided he was going to go continue college and play semi-pro basketball in Europe. So, because the basketball thing wasn't quite working out for him, he decided to take some wrestling classes. That's where we introduced to Mad Dog Buzz Sawyer. And he said that he paid $2,500. Buzz Sawyer promised him a booking out of this, in addition to teaching him how to wrestle. So from there, they do mostly conditioning in this Buzz Sawyer camp, which sounds like torture. That they were doing squats and push-ups and things until they puked. Of course, the point was to get these guys to quit. This is how wrestling was in the past, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. This is something that they were complaining about down in Deep South wrestling, which is why it had such a terrible. One of the reasons why it had such a terrible reputation is because it focused a lot on weeding out the weak, and people who don't really want to do this, getting rid of them. That was the goal of professional wrestling schools, was to keep a tight-knit group of people who respected the business, and getting people out of the business who just want to be famous or are just looking for a payday. That was the goal, was to get rid of those people. So they would run these conditioning drills. This Vern Gagne is famous for this. Stu Hart is famous for this. But now apparently Buzz Sawyer did it as well. It's just the way it was done back then. You see a lot of, you go to my Deep South Wrestling video, you can actually hear about people complaining about the amount of conditioning training they were doing. And he said he kept coming back and he didn't quit. But then, of course, one day he shows up to Buzz Sawyer's camp and Buzz Sawyer isn't even there. So Buzz had taken the money and run, didn't really teach him too much of anything, and certainly he didn't get the booking out of it. So he says that at this point he was $2,000 in the hole. Basketball was drying up and he had nothing to do, really. So he decided to go into wrestling full time. He started sort of studying the art of pro wrestling. Then he said that his parents were upset about it. His mom especially said in the documentary, because his mom is still alive, that, you're on your own. Don't call us for money. He had a hard scrabble mom, sweetest lady in the world. She did not want this wrestling thing to occur. So he had to find some way of getting attention. So he started going to the Sportatorium, which is a world-class championship wrestling. He used to run this arena. He said he used to go there every Wednesday for, a long stretch of time. I think he said like 4 or 5 months or something like that, before he finally got seen by Fritz Von Erich, who ran the territory. This would have been in the mid-'80s, so probably about 85 or 86. And he said Fritz finally saw him, thought he looked like David Von Erich, and said, got him a booking. So this when he became Texas Red. Texas Red was, sort of bland, giant dude in a mask. He was managed by Percy Pringle. And he began to get his first matches in world class. Now they kind of skipped over his brutal beating by Bruiser Brody, which I think would be something that he would have talked about, considering it became, a pretty legendary story that Bruiser Brody whooped his ass in the middle of the ring and beat him to almost half to death with a wooden chair. It was a great story. He told it on Joe Rogan. It was a great story. But from there, he decided he needed more experience. So in world class, there was a guy named Steve Simpson, who was a South African pro wrestler. And Steve Simpson met Mark Calloway and invited him to wrestle in South Africa. And Steve Simpson is actually in this documentary, which is pretty cool. It was actually pretty fun to see him in here. And while he was just 23 years old in about 1987, 1988, he was working against Tiger Ali Singh in South Africa. And this was his first introduction to riots. So he says that, he hit Tiger Ali Singh with something, made him bleed. And because Tiger Ali Singh was so beloved, that people started throwing rocks and bottles and different items at him. And he said he finally started to get it. He's only 23 years old at this point in time. So he's a green guy. He's young to the business, and he's now in the middle of his first real riot. Seems like it was a long time ago where rioting was a pretty normal thing in wrestling. It seemed like a long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago, trust me. 1989, he's no longer Texas Red. He is now the Master of Pain. It was a gimmick that he got from Jerry Lawler, because now he's moving to Memphis. Master of Pain was an ex-con gimmick. So he was Nails before Nails existed. How interesting is that? That Undertaker was Nails at a certain point before Nails existed. So he says that at this point, he's sleeping in his car. And he is, in Memphis, and now he's working with Jerry Lawler. And Jerry Lawler, of course, is the top guy in Memphis. And Lawler says, look, you can't really ignore this guy. The size of him, the athleticism, and Jerry Lawler really liked him. And because Lawler likes working with big guys, he put him over. And this was very interesting. This is a very interesting story that they kind of skipped over here about this title that Undertaker had just won from Jerry Lawler. Now, this championship, which was the USWA Unified World Title, right? It was the love child of Jerry Lawler becoming the AWA World Champion and World Class merging with Memphis. So their world title came with the Memphis belt. And he had defeated Kevin Von Erich after Super Clash 3. So this would be Jerry Lawler is a unified world champion. He has both the World Class world titles as well as the AWA world titles. And it merged into this USWA belt. Now, the companies did not merge. The AWA was still its own independent thing. But World Class and Memphis had started to merge, because I believe this is where Jerry Jarrett bought Dallas, okay? So, at this point, those world titles are still merged into one belt, which was this belt here. So if you look up the belt lineage, you will see that Undertaker, or Master of Pain, is the second USWA World Champion. But then you will, read the footnotes, and you will see that it is not recognized by AWA or World Class or PWI as being a actual world championship. So it's basically like a regional title. That if Lawler had kept his commitments to the AWA, and if, things had worked out really with the Von Erichs, Could have been considered a world championship in its own right. But because of backstage politics, and of course it's just the nature of wrestling, it ended up just being a regional title that he won. And therefore, just not really all that big of a deal. Even though it probably was a big deal at the time in Memphis that he beat Jerry Lawler and became a champion. So from here we go to WCW, where we get a little bit of backstory on the Skyscrapers, who was Dan Spivey and Sid Vicious. And Sid Vicious ended up getting injured. I think he cracked a rib or something like that, and he was out. And Jim Cornette, who was familiar with the Memphis territory, of course, this being his favorite wrestling territory, he suggested the Master of Pain, or Mark Calloway, actually fill in for Sid in the Skyscrapers, and he ended up getting the gig. So he's a Skyscraper, a tag team partner to Dan Spivey. They didn't really go into any real detail about this, which would have been fun, especially to think about what Dan Spivey really. We got what Dan Spivey thought of WCW, because he really buried WCW, and he did an excellent job of burying WCW throughout this part of the documentary. They went on and on about how WCW was basically nada. But interestingly enough, Dan Spivey and Mean Mark Callis are tag team partners for a little while. Dan Spivey starts to get frustrated because they're not being used properly, or not being used much at all, despite being tall, athletic guys. And so Dan Spivey decided to lose his mind and beat the shit out of the Road Warriors in the middle of a match, which is, let me tell you how impressive that shit is. That's some impressive sounding shit, okay? Because I remember when the Road Warriors was doing this to guys just a few years before, when they went in there to AWA and just beat up the old heads and said, fuck it. But Dan Spivey just went in there and he basically crushed these guys with chairs. And he said this was the last time him and Mark actually worked together. So they were a tag team, and Dan Spivey, basically quit and left him by himself. So, of course, Mark Callis was unused. He just kind of floated after Dan Spivey left. This is where we introduced to Paul Heyman. And Paul Heyman says that, hey, for 8 or 9 months, Undertaker didn't really do much of anything. And now it was time to talk about his contract. Ole Anderson, one of the original Four Horsemen, is the one who was negotiating the contract. He was, of course, booking the territory at the time. And he wanted a little bit of a pay bump, or at least that's what he was expecting, due to his abilities in the ring, his in-ring abilities. And this quote would haunt Ole Anderson forever. It would have been nice if they could have got Ole Anderson to at least talk about this, because I'm going to talk about it. Ole Anderson told Mean Mark Callis, again, he told Mean Mark Callis, nobody is ever going to pay to see you wrestle. And, of course, this puts a chip on Mark's shoulder, and he's very upset because he's saying, look at all these things I can do. Look at my athleticism. Look at what I can bring to the table from an in-ring perspective, and WCW didn't see any value in that. And he's talking about, how this kind of hurt his feelings. He was upset. And Paul Heyman is there to explain, look, they saw him as being a one-dimensional, boring guy. And that's really all it was. And Paul Heyman was his manager at the time. And, I don't think he was a part of the Dangerous Alliance. Was he? I don't know. WCW history is very, very shaky, especially at the beginning. So, Paul Heyman gets in contact with Bruce Pritchard, and we get a little bit more of Paul Heyman burying WCW by saying, hey, look, I was under contract to WCW, but I negotiated this deal between Mark and Bruce Pritchard to have him sent to the WWF because he truly believed that Mark had some kind of talent, and WCW couldn't bring it out of him. It was nothing. And later in the documentary, as we see the Undertaker fully formed and being this major attraction, and he said this is something WCW had, and the only thing that WCW didn't have was imagination. And imagination is very, very important in wrestling. It really is, because it helps cover up a lot of your deficiencies. If you aren't a great wrestler, you better be a great entertainer, and that makes it easier for people to accept your wrestling, your bad wrestling skills or your lack of wrestling skills. But if you're a great wrestler, and you have no entertaining skills, which is what we're talking about here with Mean Mark Callis. He was just a guy on the roster, generic giant heel. Nothing's too special about him outside of his athleticism. Then, yeah, it's easy for you to get lost in the shuffle. And to be quite honest, since most people don't know that much about Mean Mark Callis and don't really care about Mean Mark Callis, did Ole Anderson really make a bad decision? No, he didn't make a bad decision. He made the decision with all the information he had at the time. He didn't know this guy was going to transform into what he is. He can only make a decision based on the information he has at the time. And the information he has at the time is that this guy isn't worth that much. And we all make decisions based off of the best information we have at that time. That's all Ole Anderson did. So even though they was burying him and running him over with a truck in this documentary, it wasn't really his fault. What are you going to do? Overpay for a guy based off of potential? Like, very few people can get away with doing that. If you're trying to be financially responsible, you don't pay for potential. You pay for what they actually bring to the table. And, it was a little mean for him to say nobody would ever pay to see you wrestle. And that was kind of Ole Anderson's, his abrasive personality too. That's really what he's known for, as being a bit of a dickhead. And so maybe that part we can make fun of him for, because he was so egregiously wrong. But letting him get away, just like letting Steve Austin get away, it's like nobody would have known. Nobody knew what they had on their hands with these guys. So, of course, Vince also sees Mean Mark Callis, and he is a lot like Ole Anderson. He's like, look, he watched Mean Mark Callis wrestle Lex Luger at some pay-per-view. This was Bruce Pritchard introducing Mean Mark Callis. At least in this documentary, Bruce Pritchard introduced Mean Mark Callis to Vince McMahon via a tape of a match between him and Lex Luger. And Vince was unimpressed and said, "I'm not interested. I don't want anything to do with this guy. He's just, a big dude. There's nothing special about him." But, Bruce Pritchard stayed on him and, really vouched for him. So Vince took it up and said, "Okay, I'll talk to him and have one meeting." They have the meeting. It turns into a 4-hour conversation, and Vince sort of really liked him as a person and decided to bring him in. He told a little interesting story here about Mark or Undertaker going clubbing with Paul Heyman right before his big meeting with Vince. And he only brought one pair of clothes, which is the clothes he was going to wear to the meeting. And so he wears these clothes to the club and ends up tearing the pants, ripping the ass of the pants. And he had to sew them overnight, really poorly, I guess, in order to have these pants for Vince. And thankfully, I guess Vince didn't see it because he didn't notice it. So, of course, we get into the whole Undertaker stuff where, how the character was formed. And Undertaker thinking he's going to come out of a giant egg because they were introducing the giant egg and Ted DiBiase's mystery partner at the same time for Survivor Series 1990. So everybody, of course, thought they were going to be one and the same, for the most part. And Undertaker thought he's coming out of an egg. And, of course, Bruce Pritchard allowed him to think that because Bruce is, he's all about torturing people. And then he said of course, Undertaker was pitched to him. And this is kind of where I was like, I forgot how deep WWE gets sometimes, that he was presented with storyboards of what the character looked like. And you have to, that's next level. That's like, they're approaching people with storyboards. Like, hey, this is what we want the character to look like. And of course I knew they do this, but sometimes you get into that habit of, I don't think about it too much. And then you stumble across storyboards online, of Mankind or Goldust, or some of them, the crazier characters like Farouk and stuff like that. You're like, I can't believe somebody sat down and drew this out. Like Jack Kirby drew it out. and then a seamstress or something like that had to go and make the clothes for this character, and the wrestler just has to match the physical characteristics that they drew out. And so Bruce Pritchard talking about how the character was initially supposed to be his partner, or his heavy, so it had to be the opposite of him. So that's why the character became all black, because Brother Love only wore white. So the character had to wear black, and so that was that. And then, of course, as they were drawing it, they came across one of the Grim Reaper, which is him with a scythe and everything, and a hoodie and all that kind of stuff. And one of the ones that came across was the old Western style Undertaker. And to see the art piece, it was phenomenal, because Mark matched it completely. When he grew his hair out anyway, he matched the idea of what they had for this character completely. And it turns out that his mom actually worked in a cemetery when he was a kid. And it was real funny that his mom wanted to take absolutely zero credit. He hated The Undertaker. This is why I say his mom stole the show, because she told the unvarnished truth about her hatred, not only of his chosen profession, but her hatred of pretty much everything that involved Undertaker at this point. She didn't like the character. She said the character was too mean and it was too weird. And they also tell stories of her trying to attack Sid Vicious. And so he banned her from coming to wrestling shows after that, because Sid had worked her up so heavily. But she was, of course, an absolute darling woman. And there's a picture of her in this documentary wearing the WWF title, like the winged eagle. She's wearing it. It is a badass picture. I love that picture. I'm hoping that I can find it online somewhere. I will actually post it. It's actually pretty damn cool. His mom working at a cemetery was awesome. That was an awesome little touch to the character, because, of course, Bruce Pritchard was helping to write TV, and he was doing on-screen stuff, so he couldn't travel with Mark and the rest of the crew, and so they needed somebody with him, because the Undertaker couldn't really talk. The purpose of the character was to say as little as possible. So they hired his old manager, Percy Pringle, who actually was a licensed mortician. And so it all just kind of brought together, the Undertaker. And it was like lightning in a bottle. What's the likelihood that his mom really worked in a cemetery at one point in his life, and that his old manager, when he was just coming up, was a licensed mortician? All these, through lines converge at once. It's not even lightning in a bottle at that point. It's too coincidental to be a coincidence. You can't recreate that. And so that's basically how The Undertaker was born. And then he goes through talking about how he added different things to the character, like the eye roll. And he said he didn't know why he did it. There was no real funny story to the eye roll. There was nobody told him to do it. He just did it in a match against Frank the Hammer Valentine, and the camera caught it, and they thought it was a great look. And of course, he said he took the whole tongue thing, even though he started doing it later in his career. He took that from Gene Simmons from Kiss, and the Tombstone Power Driver, which is actually Andre the Giant's old finish. I'm surprised they didn't mention that. That considering he was in the Andre the Giant role as the Giant attraction, you would have thought they would have mentioned that Andre the Giant used the Tombstone Power Driver as a finish, but they didn't. So that was interesting. Wonder why they didn't mention it. So after they talk about the formation of the Undertaker character, it kind of goes a little bit into tribute territory, where, we get some backstage stuff where we talk about BSK, his little crew of guys who played dominoes and and drank Jack Daniels and hung around with each other. That was fun, but I would have liked to see more of those guys. Like Savio Vega wasn't there, and Rikishi was there but a little bit. We know that Yoko was dead, but it would have been nice if we could have told more stories from their perspective. And I know there's a table for 3, or I think it's 4 with BSK. I will be watching that eventually. I just haven't watched it yet. So that was cool. We talked about fans getting Undertaker tattoos, which is awesome. And yes, like some of the first cosplay I've ever saw was on Undertaker. As a kid, I used to see people dressed as Undertaker and be like, why are they doing that? And, you see why. It's just a really cool character. He talks a lot about the streak, the formation of the streak, and how it was totally an accident. And it wasn't until Michael Hayes recognized it that people even knew what the streak was. It was a thing. And that's when they started to, once he was brought to Vince's attention that he was undefeated at WrestleMania, decided to do something with it. And talking about the streak, of course, they talked about the 4-year story between him and Triple H and him and Shawn Michaels that culminated in Shawn Michaels' retirement and the end of the era. They talked a little bit about that. They talked about his surgeries, and they talked a lot about his family, his second wife. But there was no mention of, like, gigantic controversy. Like, this was one of the feel-good episodes where they didn't dig into anything too controversial. Like, the most controversial thing here is that he was too far gone into the Undertaker persona. And the typical wrestler, I was on the road all the time, so I didn't get to spend time with my kids. It would have been nice if his son would have been there, Gunner especially, if they could have talked about, how they felt with him not being around. So this documentary, it was good, but we've honestly done better. Like the series that WWE did for the network was infinitely better than this A&E biography. And it's very interesting because they do biographies on the same people multiple times. And it's hard to find new information and new stuff. But they still did bring something new to the table in this biography. For instance, talking to his mom. Talking about Steve Simpson and, showing clips of him in Memphis and showing clips of him in World Class. That stuff was good because the last ride was not a focus of his entire career. It was a focus of the last, real harsh focus on the last several years of him trying to give it up. And we didn't spend a lot of time on that either. It was kind of really boiled down to the fact that he retired because he couldn't physically do it anymore. And when you talk about the last ride, it had this element of tragedy to it because he was like, hey, Shawn Michaels got this magical final match. And his entire last, 4 or 5 years as The Undertaker was him trying to create that magical last final match for himself, and he was unable to do it. So I would have liked for them to talk about that here. Talk about that, sort of addiction, that chase, that envy that he had of his peers and them getting much better ends to their career than he felt like he got. Even though, we know he didn't go out too badly because he went out on the Boneyard match, but he never really got that great in-ring finish that, Shawn did. Or Flair, even though Flair insists on, screwing with that, he didn't get the big goodbye that they got. And as far as having one of the better matches of the later years of his career. And so I would have liked for them to focus a little bit on that. Would have liked to focus on, they kind of flew over all of his other marriages to talk about Michelle McCool. So you didn't really get too much controversy out of this thing. It was purely, if you love Undertaker, you will like this biography. Nothing in here was going to offend you. Nothing in here was going to make you mad. Unlike the other biographies, especially the Macho Man one, which pissed everybody off. There was nothing in here that was going to upset you. There was nothing here that was going to damage the reputation of the character or anything like that. So for that, it was fun. But I think it was like half a biography and half a tribute show. But let me know what you guys think. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later, man. Peace out.